So the following topic is a topic that I've long been interested in. One could say, theoretically, that I've been interested in this topic since first grade or second grade. It's not the only such topic. There are many inyanim that I feel like I'm circling back around to topics that began at a very young age. At any rate, I'm not sure what the right cheder here is. Should we jump right into the text? Should I give an introduction? But I assume you'll see a title to the video. The title to the video is, we're going to talk about how Torah, specifically Chumash, is taught in cheder. And we're going to discuss some of the big arguments, some of the big disputes between the Charedim, the traditionalists 100 years ago, 150 years ago, versus the Mechadshim, whether they were maskilim, whether they were reform, whether they were tzionim. That's not to say that they're all 100% identical, but as we'll see, all three actually had something to say on the topic that we're about to discuss. So we're going to get into this question of what the stances were between the two camps, and then the question of where is the frum world holding today? Is the frum world still in what was then the traditionalist camp, or have we slowly edged across the field and we are in a way closer to the maskilim's camp and sort of belatedly following the prescriptions of the educational prescriptions of the maskilim? That is essentially the premise. And more specifically, I'll mention Bekitzer that we're talking about the question of skipping Chumash, and that question can contain a few elements to it. First of all, is the goal to complete Chamisha Chumshei Torah? Already Chadarim even doing that or trying to do that, certainly in the English-speaking world, and I'll include Chabad for the sake of this discussion in the English-speaking world, although Chabad is sort of a memotza in that. And then more specifically, skipping certain parshias or parts of certain parshias, that really is going to be our focus. So just to give you some minimal framing before we jump into it. But otherwise, the alternative intro to this would be that this is based on a letter of the Rebbe Rashab that I came across this week. It's actually related to the dates, but not today's date, but a few days ago. This is a letter from Chai Tammuz, Tafresh Samach Beis, and I was looking at this earlier this week in conjunction with Chai Tammuz, but however, for whatever reason, I didn't get around to recording it on that day, but I was thinking about it today and how much we recorded this week, and I figured, you know what, a shame, a shod, not to record it just because we missed the right date. Chai Tammuz, I'm sure the audience will forgive me. I hope I don't see in the back end, in the YouTube studio, in the statistics, that everyone's tuning out right at this moment, 3 minutes in, because you heard me say that it's Chai Tammuz and not today's date. At any rate, this is a letter of the Rebbe Rashab, printed in Igros Kodesh Chelik Gimel of the Rebbe Rashab. For those who are familiar, the Rebbe Rashab's letters sort of go in two loops. Chelik Aleph and Beis start at the beginning, the earliest letters we have, and sort of go through his life till the end. And then Chelik Gimel Dalet Hey restart that cycle, a very large archive of letters, apparently only became accessible within a few years of publishing the first two volumes. So at this point, the Rebbe Rashab's letters are always, it's always a matter of jumping back and forth, skipping back and forth between the letters in the first set, the first two volumes, and the letters in the second set, the next three volumes. Then there's a sixth volume as well that came out a few years ago with a few Safas, but not quite the same Vart. There always are krachim of Miluim, but in this case, it's mamish like two overlapping sets. So this is in Chelik Gimel, and this is a letter from Chai Tammuz Tafresh Samach Beis, so that would be 1902. And it's letter number 789, and it's page 351. And this is a letter of the Rebbe Rashab to one of the Gvirim in his circle, who his name was Rebbe Shaya Berlin. We're not going to get into the Rebbe Rashab circle and the Gvirim in Rebbe Shaya Berlin, but suffice it to say, the Rebbe Rashab had a circle of Gvirim, of influential people, and he kept them in the loop and would send them very detailed updates. In the past, I've perhaps commented or thought that it seems like this wasn't so much the case with the Rebbe, but then actually over time, I've come to realize that it's hard to really say anything and make assumptions without seeing the complete record. And as is often the case, we don't have the complete record. And even as we speak, the last few years, there's been a huge chunk of the Rebbe's letters from the early years that are being declassified slowly every week. We're not going to get into it. Maybe I've mentioned it before, but it's actually hard to make guesses and assumptions and statements without being privy to the complete record. And that's always something that drives me a bit crazy. But that's not directly relevant to the topic at hand. So this is a letter to Rebbe Shai Berlin. And for those who are familiar with Rebbe Rashab's letters of this kind often cover a lot of topics. They're not necessarily very broad and eloquent and soaring. They're sort of personal, technical letters, but referring to the technicalities of the ongoing matters, haskanos, personal stuff, whatever was going on. So I'm not here to go through the entire letter. I'm here to focus on one particular detail that comes up in this letter. So the second paragraph of the letter mentions that Rebbe Shai Berlin had been contacted by Kovna. Who's Kovna? By Kovna we mean the famous Askin Rebbe Yaakov Lipschitz, author of the autobiographical memoir Zichron Yaakov about his Askanos. We know he was the right-hand man of Rebbe Chanan Spector, and was very involved in fighting for Haredi causes and anti-maskilim's causes at that time. And at that time, apparently, in the footnote, Rebbe Rashab writes that at that time, Kovna had established a lishka, an office, L'Achzakas Hadas, and at that time, the more secular press, the Hebrew Jewish press at the time that was leaned more secular, used to attack this office very much. They called it Lishka HaShchera because I guess up until that point it was really the maskilim and other such entities, Zionists, who were organized, who had offices, who had a budget, and the frum world was playing defense. And I guess you could say this was a historic moment when the frum world started counter-organizing and streamlining and creating an office and creating a program and a budget, as opposed to earlier ad hoc askanos. I'm sure greater experts can weigh in as to whether that would be an accurate historical statement, but it feels right, at least to me, at least right now. So this was the founding of the Lishka, and it seems like they reached out to Rebbe Shai Berlin to perhaps get some support. And then I guess the Rebbe Shai Berlin forwarded it to Rebbe Rashab to hear what the Rebbe Rashab has to say to. So the Rebbe Rashab says, the letter that you received from Kovna, and I'm sending it back to you after Rebbe Shai had probably sent it to Rebbe Rashab. So we don't have the letter necessarily that they're talking about, but Rebbe Rashab says that there's a fellow by the name of Reb Zalman Landa who seems to be involved, and he's a nagid v'nichbad, and he's giving a lot of koiches and time for these inyanim without interruption against the mischadshim, against the tziyonim, and he definitely deserves praise for his greatest askos. So the Rebbe Rashab seems to be praising these efforts, even though they were not connected to Lubavitch, to Chabad, to Chassidus, but the Rebbe Rashab did see them as allies in this fight, and the Rebbe Rashab seemed to appreciate the fact that they may be organizing and streamlining. And then the Rebbe Rashab goes on and says, seemingly behemshach to that, HaMaimer Darka Shel Torah Hu Inyan Nichbad. The article, the essay, Darka Shel Torah, is a very respectable inyan. And what is it? It's Neged Mashalim Dim Ka'ez Alpi Hametidus. However you want to pronounce it. Obviously, it's a Hebrew spelling for the word in English that we pronounce methods. So I'm just going to say methods probably going forward. So this essay is against how they're learning or they're teaching according to the methods. And they received letters, they received signatures of many Rabbanim of the gedolim. Lashon is Chasimis Rabbanim Harbim Me HaGedolim, Ve'eze Me Harahagim, Me Harabanim HaGoinim. It seems to perhaps be somewhat of a wry, tongue-in-cheek reference to certain people are Harav HaGoyin status. Today there's been inflation, but back then Harav HaGoyin was top-tier status, so I assume, I guess we could speculate who's higher, the Gedolim or the Harabanim HaGoyinim. But he's alluding to the fact that Gedolim and some of the Harahagim, Harabanim HaGoyinim, Kamo Harav HaGoyin Mibrisk, Umi Karlin, that will be Reb Chaim Brisker and Reb Davidel of Karlin, Many others went out with special articles, essays against the methods. So this Maimer Darka Shel Torah is in response to some kind of new educational methods, and it has chasimus of chashuvim, and it mentions specifically Chaim Brisker and Abdullah of Karlin. And it says it's important to print. He's still referring to the Maimer Darka Shel Torah, and we'll get to what it is exactly in a moment, because that's sort of the focus here. It's going to be the focus here of sort of identifying what the Rebbe Rashab is talking about. Why is it important? Even in the Kasher Talmud Torahs, they're also following the methods. So it's not just awareness of the divide of we're on this side and they're on that side, but rather even people on our side are being swayed. And even though these Talmidei Torah are under Tashkacha of Rabbanim Yereim, but yet they're following the methods. It's problematic, it's disturbing, and we need to be ma'ir against the methods. And I even spoke to such a Rav who was supervising, was responsible. I told him he shouldn't allow this, and he answered that why should he be against it? He doesn't have a basis to oppose it. But once it's printed, we have Kama Rabbanim Gedolim against the method. So then the Rabbanim Yereim will have the ability to come and oppose it and say, hey, look, this is what the Rabbanim, this is what the Gedolim said. So if we have a kasher Talmud Torah, then we have to follow what the Rabbanim and the Gedolim and the Goinim were ma'ir, and the Malamdim Akshedim, whether it's an organized Talmud Torah, whether it's Malamdim, the kasher Malamdim will cease from this kind of limud. So the Rebbe Rashab is pivoting from the question of the office and covenant to this Maimer Darka Shel Torah, and the Rebbe Rashab seems to be encouraging B'Shai Berlin perhaps to support its publication and distribution. And then the Rebbe Rashab circles back to the Lishkin covenant. So B'derech Klal, Lishkin covenant is involved in all these matters. He throws in a line in Yiddish, and they're gay and outs. They get to the bottom of everything. And they publicize the kfira of the Mischadshim and the Tziyonim. And he mentions an interesting expose that they found an Österreichische Wochenschrift, an Austrian newspaper that released the inside numbers of the colonial bank, the Zionist bank, and Dr. Bloch, the publisher of that publication, who's opposed to Zionism. I didn't go look up to see what his exact story was, what his stance was, and where his opposition to Zionism came from. It's very incidental to our topic and focus here. But the Dr. Bloch is exposing that the numbers don't add up, and the Rebbe Rashab was seemingly excited about this, that there will be a financial expose of the financial misdeeds and mishandling within the Zionist bank. So the Lishka of Covenant is doing a good job. So the Lishka of Covenant, so yeah, the Lishka of Covenant is indeed worthy of the support. They're doing well, they're doing a good job. And so therefore, so it would be right for you to send them money. So here he mentions the cheveres again, the cheveres Darka Shel Torah. First he called it a mimer, now he calls it a cheveres, Darka Shel Torah booklet. So it certainly would be good to support that in particular. And the same, and as well, for the rest of the other stuff, other projects, other stuff they're doing as well. And from there, the Rebbe Rashab goes on to talk about other matters relating to B'Shai Berlin, property in Eretz Yisrael, a whole separate parsha, not negeya to us. So there's this larger point here about the Lishka of Covenant. There's this point about the Zionist bank, but then there's this specific point about the Maimor, the Cheveres Darka Shel Torah, and it has the Chasimus, and it's exposing the methods, and even the Kasher Talmud Torahs are using the methods, so this will give them fuel to be able to drop it, to oppose it, which the Rebbe Rashab seems to think is very important. So as I said, one larger takeaway here is that the Rebbe Rashab seems to be interested and excited in sort of modernizing and using their own tools and weapons against them. They had newspapers, they were probably writing exposés on the traditional Jewish life, the traditional Haredi way of doing things. So the Rebbe Rashab is recognizing the importance of using the same tools against them. And so if there's an exposé into their finances in some newspaper somewhere, and this office is going to be all over it, so that's great. So like I said, that seems to be a notable point. But more specifically, there is this, the Rebbe Rashab is talking about this Maimer Darka Shel Torah and the methods. So what's Maimer Darka Shel Torah and what are the methods? What are we talking about? So already Rebbe 11 was Mitzayin there on the bottom. Rebbe 11 was Mitzayin, Darka Shel Torah, Kuntris Nidpis Bevilna, Tafresh Samach Beis. So mamash around that time. It's not clear the Rebbe Rashab is saying that they should send money to print it. So either he knew about it before it was printed or had already been printed, but the more money you send, the more copies could be printed and distributed. So it was printed mamash around that time. But I'm sure most people reading the Rebbe Rashab's Igros wouldn't have any idea beyond that as to what we're talking about. Living in the era that we live in today, it's a whole different story, and it's very easy to go, whether to search Yitzhar Chachma or to search the National Library of Israel's catalog or elsewhere. And indeed, it is easy to find the Kuntris Darka Shel Torah, the one that's being mentioned, the one in question. As it happens, it was actually reprinted a few times afterwards, so one's odds of finding it 20 years ago and beyond were not zero, but I'm sure it was still harder for your average random person to find it. So I'm going to highlight and spotlight what this kuntris is about. And I would argue that most people, even those who are interested in the chinuch and changes in the chinuch, are not directly familiar with the contents of this kuntris. And this kuntris will provide some interesting context, some additional interesting and important context for where we're coming from on the questions of chinuch and what the stances of the maskilim were versus the stances of the charedim. So the kuntris, the Sharblat, I'm holding a printout in front of me. Sharblat says, Darka Shel Torah, Derech HaChinuch Le'Yaldi Yisrael V'Limud HaTorah HaKadosh Al Pidas Chazal U'Mesoides Avos Shero U'Matzu Zkenim Shebedor HaGoinim HaGedolim Amudei HaTorah V'Hayirah V'Tzadikim HaMefarsamim Shlita Eitz Lasis LaHashem Lo Teiroseh LaShmi Yadaitam V'Hayirasam B'Vir Mitzvah Shanta Banach Pidas Rabbeinu Rabbeinu HaKadoshim. Sounds like the kind of lashon and nuschayos you might see on a polemical kuntris today. So it's nice to see when those lashonos began being used. But the Chazal, Mesoides Avos, Zakenim Shebedor, Goinim HaGedolim, yeah, good. Yatzel La'or V'Nitpas Beheskim HaRavanim HaGoinim Shlita HaNeshama Medaf HaSheni, printed in Vilna, Tfus Yud Porozhnikov, Tafresh Samach Beis, 1902. So the next page indeed has a very nice chashuv list of Goinim HaGedolim. Some of them are more famous and some are less. Also, if you look at the list, you'll understand the Rebbe Rashab's nusach, because there really are two lists. One list is Shemus HaGoinim HaGedolim HaBoim Al Chasum Shlita, and then there's a separate list of Eila HaRabbanim HaGoinim HaGedolim Shlita Sheisifu Devreim Kegachli Eish Das V'Michteve Yad Kodsham Shekosfu Lechazikas Kol Ha'amor B'Darka Shel Torah. And there, of those taka, one of them is Reb Chaim Brisker, one of them is Reb David Friedman. So the Rebbe Rashab's lashon is alluding to these two lists. Is the Shemus HaGoinim HaGedolim, which the Rebbe Rashab referred to in short as HaGedolim, and then HaRabbanim HaGoinim HaGedolim Shlita, that the Rebbe Rashab referred to Bekitzer as HaRahagim. So the list of the Goinim HaGedolim who signed on generally to the Teichen HaKuntris is Reb Elia Feinstein of Pruzin, Reb Eliezer Gordon of Telz, Reb Eliezer Rabinovich of Minsk, Reb Chaim Shlomo Zalman of Lipna, Reb Benzion of Bilsk. In Grodna, there are four Rabbanim, Rabbani Go'ene Hamatz signed. Interestingly, here you see both the Grodna and the Horodna spelling. Not everyone even realizes that's the same place, but the old Yiddish name was Horodna, and then the more Russian name Grodna sort of slowly replaced it. So here you have Grodna, Rabbani Go'ene Hamatz, signed Eliakim Shlomo Shapira Matz in Horodna. So in their Chasimus, they wrote Horodna, but on the list, they wrote Grodna. So him and three others. The list continues. Reb Chaim Berlin, in the city he was in, a little hard to pronounce. Reb Chaim Meir Noach Levin in Vilna. Reb Chiel Michal Epstein in Navardik. That's, of course, the Aruch HaShulchan. Reb Yitzhak Blazer Melafonim Rav in Peterburg. Reb Yeshua of Zarek. Reb Yitzhak Yaakov Rabinovich of Panovich. Yehuda Lipshitz of Merch. Reb Yosef Zundel of Eisheshok. And that is Rabbi Yosef Zundel Hutner, not to be confused with Rabbi Yosef Zundel Salant, who lived a generation or two earlier. Rabbi Yitzchak Feigenbaum of Varsha, Rabbi Yudalei B'rif of Zagar Chada, Shemeshe Danishevsky of Slobodka, Rabbi Moshe Shapiro of Riga, Rabbi Meir Atlas of Kabrin, Rabbi Moshe Shmuel Shapiro of Obroisk, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Broid of Zagar Yoshin, Rabbi Fol Shapiro of Volozhin, Rabbi Shimon Bar of Shadlitz. So like I said, some of these are very famous still today, some of them are moderately famous, some of them are maybe a little bit more obscure. And then you have the Rabbanim gedolim Shlita who contributed their own Michtevei Yad Kodshim as well. Rebbe Chaim Meisel of Lodz, Rebbe David Friedman of Karlin, Rebbe Hish Rabinovich of Kovna, Rebbe Lipschitz of Lublin, Rebbe Chaim Levi Soloveitchik of Brisk Lita, Rebbe Chaim Ezer Grzinski of Vilna, Rebbe Yosef Schloffer of Slonim, and Rebbe Yosef Rosen of Dvinsk. That's the Rogachover. And L'chayda, there is some distinction here, perhaps, that these this second list are taka considered higher profile, more chashiv, and perhaps that's why they are in their own category and we get their own letters separately, whereas perhaps the earlier list are taka considered a tier below them and aren't worthy of sending their own letter, but maybe that's just an arbitrary distinction, and those who sent letters went on one list, and those who didn't send went on another list. We'll have to ask the bigger experts who can be moided in the shire how exactly everyone ranked back in Tafresh Samach Beis. So at any rate, Darka Shel Torah, so we have to be mekatzer somewhat. I am keeping that in mind here. So I'm really going to try to focus just on the topic that I particularly am interested in. But it begins, Omer Chazal, Katnei Yedei L'daber of Malam Di Torah, Kriya Shema. So this is Yisoid of Chinuch. What's the Nakud of Chinuch? What's the Nakud of teaching? B'zeh Hoydelonu Chazal, that the mitzvah al Aviv is L'sum B'fiv is Ikrei Ha'amunah of Yisoid Yadas. You start with Torah Tziva, Shema Yisrael, Kabbalah Samach Shemayim, all mitzvahs, talk later the Lubavitcher Rebbe with the Yud Beis Psukim of Amar Chazal. So taka, the first two are Torah Tziva and Shema Yisrael. Pashtus for this reason. I'm sure if you go back to see how the Rebbe explained it, I'm sure it's bad for this reason. So that's why you're starting Nafka with these two Psukim. You have to inculcate the children with these values of Kabbalah Samach Shemayim, Kabbalah Salam Mitzvahs. And then after that, it's Vishant L'Benecha and the Matam Yisrael Smenechem Dabar Bam. And Kol Lamas Ben B'nai Torah Mal V'Kasav Kilu Kibla Mihar Sinai. So the Yanam of Chinuch, it's a chayva also on the tzibur. If the father of an individual child can't take care of it, Halach and Rambam, Halach and Yeredeya, Meshivim Malam Ditonaikis. So sort of setting the context of teaching, where teaching fits in Yiddishkeit. And what are we teaching? So the Torah we're teaching includes Mikra Mishnah Gemara, Chamisha Chumshe Torah, Nevi'im Ksuvim. And the Talmud includes Mishnah Gemara, Medrashas Agadas, Teresh Baal Peh. And the point of all of it is Lahavin Alahaskel, Bamitasa Shel Torah, Liskadish Biktushasa, Lishmer Velasas, Lekayim Yipoyel, Mitzvah Hashem Kilu Cheseyan. So it's all about being a good Jew and being the best Jew you could be, and that's what the chinuch is for. It's not stam, as they're going to get to, not stam to reach educational goals, but it's very specifically goals within Kedusha, to shape a child to follow on the Heilige path. And therefore, b'derech hamoivel el hatachlis hakedosha hazois. So in order to get to this holy objective, so every Yid has to educate his sons himself, or through malamdim ha'holchim b'teiras Hashem, b'derech shehochu rabbeinu v'aveseinu me'olam. You have to go in the traditional way. Lamdom l'chancham l'chakmam chamishuchim sheter novim ksuvim al derech hapshat. So it's tak al derech hapshat, but it has to combine with Meseiras Chazal and the Agadas. Kafi Pirish Rashi, Ush'arei Mefarshim Rishonim. So we try to have this balance of Pshat, but with the Mesorah, and that's embodied by Rashi and other Mefarshim. And when you teach the Torah in this way, so the Torah, first of all, B'Kedushas Elikis is Mikadesha, so it's get to a Helikite. But in addition to that, it's Meshareshus Benafsham, the Emunah, and the Deis Hamitiyas, Musar, Midas Toivis. And you start with Chumash in that way until you get them to the Darga of Limud HaTalmud and Mefarshav, until Bir Halacha. And they see that their teachers and their luminaries are being kind of tired of themselves and following the paths that they're teaching them. And Chalila, for there to be a stira between what the Malamdim are teaching versus what the Malamdim are doing. So the Malamdim have to be embodying what they're teaching. And B'derech HaChinuch HaKadosh Hazeh, so this is the idealistic version of the traditional Chinuch. And B'derech HaChinuch HaKadosh Hazeh, Zachu Avis Lahakim Deiris Yisharim Baruchim LaHashem, Lo Terasa, Yisrael Lachayim. They're also loyal servants to their kings and to the lands. Throw that in as well, why not? Why? Because the chinuch wasn't just arbitrary, it just wasn't just whatever they felt like, but so very strong appeals to tradition and how we always did it, and this is the correct way, this is the holy way. And so it's very clear this is the aim, this is the focus. We're not stammering Chumash for the fun of it, but rather there's a very specific goal, a very specific objective. And it's not L'Shem Yidias Kodesh Yisrael, to know Jewish history and to learn Hebrew. So now they're clarifying what they're targeting, what they're aiming. So there's this whole other stream and wing that's clearly de-emphasizing the first point, the stuff we just listed, and instead emphasizing Jewish history and Hebrew. And they're responding and saying that's not the case. That's what the Toyim think, but rather it's to learn Torah mitzvahs, Amunas V'Deis, Musar Umidis, Tara and Kedusha. That's what it's about, and to be loyal to the Malchayim or Larasas Mishveseim, Hadzikna V'Seva. So maybe also a dig at Zionism, because Zionism maybe is undermining the loyalty to the lands they're in. And when the children learn Chamisha Chumshe Torah, Nevi'im Uksuvim, and the Gemara in this way, Ben Bela they'll also learn. They'll have a yediyah b'darkei lashon hakodesh that will be more incidental to the real focus. Aval b'dar shalafanei. And here's where they get to the point that we're interested in. B'dar shalafanenu l'davoin levavenu. We have mischakmim. They want to kill the Teiras Chaim with a poisonous kiss. What's their agenda and how are they doing it? First, they use trickery. They're praising the Melitza and the Shir in the Tanakh. Oh, the Hebrew is so beautiful. We need to focus on the beauty. It's not. We're not knocking the Tanakh. We're saying how beautiful it is, and also the Pshat Shel Mikra. And after they learn the Psukim, but as pasha, the real Pshat as possible. But by doing that, by focusing on that, so automatically they knock the Torah Shebal Peh, Hamekubelas. And in this fashion, Yirmasu B'derech Chilucham, they trample the Chelek Hadrash and the Agoda of Rebbe Sinu Agdoshim until the children look at it as narishkeit and falsehood, Chalila. And in this way, they managed to mamash flip it around to the Olam, the big chunk of the Olam. They took the knowledge of Lashon HaKodesh, which is really just a means to understanding the Torah, and they turned that into the main objective. And the real tachlis of Limud HaTorah, that became the means to the objective of learning Hebrew. So they flipped it all around. And now they get to their next point, because they flipped the objective around. So now the Torah is just a means to learn Hebrew. So now the Torah itself becomes temporary. The Sifrei Methodis, the books of the methods. The methods is a stand-in for educational materials, curriculums, etc. The Torah is secondary, and the method books, that's the main thing. Some of them teach Torah the way they teach secular history. But Yikra, Karbanas, that Chazal say, Yevayu Torah, Misasku B'Torah, and they skip completely, they don't teach it. And here's the part that I'm particularly interested in. They add, V'chein medalgam al kama parshiyas she'eino nois be'einehem lelamdam klal yiladim. And also, clearly meaning not just Vayikra, but earlier in Bereshis, etc., they skip a number of parshiyas that don't find favor in their eyes. They don't think it's appropriate to teach it to children. Which our ancestors, our Zaydas, our Rebbes, never had this concern that maybe the young children are going to have some michshel from Parshas in the Torah HaKadoshah. And they say that's taka how it's always been. Nichnusu tamid, Yiddish kinder. They would start with Torah, and from there they would move on, and they didn't skip these parashas. Shekulan yafai sumasukos. They're all beautiful and zis, and like it says in the Medrash, Shchaydes Ka'erev. And one of the Meiroim says, what's Shchaydes Ka'erev? That it's referring to the parashas Shel Torah. That Alpha Bishinidas Ki'ilu Hein Ku'uris Shchaydes La'amim Barabim. Some of them seem inappropriate, and the Medrash gives an example of Ziva and Negoyim, Nida and Yoldis. Why are we talking about this? Hashem says, Harei hein, Harei v'yisalai. They're sweet to me, V'arvel Hashem minchas Yehuda, etc. And then quote another Gemara, Kalem shmuzu no, v'shmuzu eneno, ma'abed hainish l'Torah. It's not for you to decide that this part of Torah is better than the other part. This is appropriate, this is not appropriate. Ubefeidish amru. And they quote a Gemara Megillah, Maisa loy to shtei benoisav nikro metargem. The Mishnah talks about certain parshas that when you read them in Kriyas HaTorah, Samal, through the time of the Goyinim, part of Kriyas HaTorah was you read the Psukim, and there was Targum, and you had a Bal Cheder, and you had a Bal Metargum. Well, the Bal Cheder was actually supposed to be every oil was supposed to be Cheder, and then I think there was one Metargum who was the Metargum Kavua. And there was a Ganze Seder, and the Teimanim, at least some of them still keep that, and that's the Kriyas HaTorah Lefi Chazal. Whereas the Ashkenazim, the Sfardim, etc., somehow managed to drop it along the way. There have been conversations, discussions about Shnei Mikra V'Echatargum, whether Shnei Mikra V'Echatargum Gufa was supposed to be partly in the context of preparing for the Kriya and the Targum, and that would explain why there's an union to do it. We're not going to get into that right now. But the Mishnah talks about there's certain parshias that tend to have something inappropriate about them, although we'll get into what's inappropriate. Is it the very nature, or is it a specific detail or specific implication about a specific person? So the Mishnah says there's certain parshias that are not metargim. But the Gemara says, Gemara Megillah, Daf Chaf Hei says, Ma'aseh loy to shtei b'noisav. That one, you read it and you're metargim it. Back to Gemara Pshita. Like, obviously, why not? Why would you think otherwise? Meaning, as they're about to say, it's not like every parsha that we would tag as inappropriate now, like that's the issue. Because if that was the issue, then you shouldn't translate any of these things. But the Gemara says, Pshita, like obviously you're metargim. The Gemara says, maybe you would be chayshish for the covet of Avram Avinu. The Gemara, as we'll see, the Gemara is sort of, we're usually concerned, the Mishnah is concerned about the covet of certain biblical figures. So here, whose covet is at stake here? Light, who cares about light? So the Gemara says, no, maybe it's also Avram's covet. And the mice of Tamar and Yehuda is also metargim. Pshita, maybe we should, the Gemara says, maybe we'd be chayshish for the covet of Yehuda. Zok the Kuntris, Here's the idea that this concern of it's not appropriate is totally not a concern. Because if that was a concern, then the Gemara should have mentioned that. That was the Havamina, that my Havamina was it's inappropriate. Kamash Malan, that you should translate it. They don't even mention that as a Havamina. They say Pshita. So that clearly wasn't a concern. And it's not like, oh, adults, yeah, and children now, we don't teach it to Tinaikas. There are places where Chazal say, but we don't find that there's a distinction here that you don't teach children certain things. And it says, what negative reishim you're making when you skip, and the children notice that you're skipping, so it makes a bad reishim on the children. They think, oh, is there's stuff in the Torah that's talking out appropriate? There's dvarim mechuarim, stuff that the Malamedim are embarrassed to teach. Is this Torah Hashem to be Tzemach Tzedek Meshivas Nafesh? And now we tack it to be Mekat, so we can't go through the whole entire kuntres. There'll be way too much. They go on, they're criticizing all the other stuff they're doing, the curriculum, they're bringing kfira in, they're bringing criticism of Chazal, criticism of Tanakh, and they're bringing new modern texts, love stories, Sipurei Ahavim, that we never knew of, to be Metama Lashon HaKodesh, Behapach of what the Rambam says of why Lashon HaKodesh is called Lashon HaKodesh. And then they add the irony, the hypocrisy, Oisam Ha'anoshim, Shamayim Es Yiladeim, Mekama Parsha Shebetorah, the ones that are skipping the Parshas because of a Chash Rachik, that maybe it's going to harm their sensitive souls, Heim Ba'atzma Mafkirim Oisam, Lekriya Nefraza, Sheim Ashkim Moichem Alibam Besipurei Agavim. Yet they let them read terrible contemporary stuff that puts a poison in them. And this is an interesting irony that comes up in other larger discussions, even outside the Jewish world, of you take America and the sensitivities on the one hand, in the mainstream American culture, the sensitivities on the one hand of certain words or certain things you can't teach the children, but at the same time the things that children are exposed to. So it's interesting to see this duality, this bifurcation sort of being a through line in Western society, Western civilization in the last few hundred years, including here in the case of modernizing Jews 100 years ago. But further, they say Nechzanan, how far off they've gone from the derech of our forefathers, and here they present an idealized version of traditional chinuch. Amal, the previous generation, the fathers would talk to each other to figure out who the best malamed would be for their children, Mursuk Shamayim, and they would make sure that the Talmidim were joining Chaverim that are on the same level, so they will all be on the same level, all be on the same page, and they would make sure that they wouldn't accept additional Talmidim beyond a certain number, and they would come and visit the cheder very often themselves to supervise, to make sure the children are learning, and the malamed would come every week to each individual house to test the child in front of the father, so the father could see what the malamed accomplished with the Talmud. So interesting description in its own right of what this idealized version was once upon a time. And now this is a whole new movement that the ikar is the language and the history, and that's the whole Yiddishkeit. And when you make a bracha by the bris, it's just a shigra delishna, it's the old door over the bottle. And now, since according to the Mada Chadasha, the ikar is, the whole ikar of Torah is the Lashon Kodesh, through the methods, the methods, and the Shiri Choil. So the Melamdim themselves are forced to compete with each other to prove that they're up to date, they have the latest pedagogical advances. And it goes on to describe this downfall, this path they're falling down in great detail, which we'll have to be mekatzer and skip. And then they make this point of al hakoil mashkichim b'yom ha'ele. All the following stuff everyone's super into. Shiyu b'cheder storim noim, avir toiv, chinuch mesukon u'mesulsel lefiyat hamachadash. Everything should be modernized and fresh and good. All the externals, but not the ikar, the yisai, Torah b'tarasa hamitis, that the children should get a chinuch dosri u'musari, and they should be mekayim the mitzvah poil. And they go on in this vein, and they say, we found it's a mitzvah and a chayva to announce the following. Number one, mechuyev kol echad miYisrael, teach your children dafke chamisha chumshei Torah novim uksuvim, according to the pshat hayosher v'hakosher, with Pirush Rashi, Sh'orei mefarshim rishonim, that's pshat that fits with Kabbalah's Chazal, and it's to train their minds and their hearts be'emunah v'das, musar u'midas, yiras chalikim u'melech. They always have to throw in the melech as well, that are derived from the Torah that they're learning, the Nevi'im, the Ksuvim, and they're on a path so that they begin learning the Talmud, the Gemara that we daven, we say every day in Av, Berchas Ava, V'seim Yilbin Lahav, and Lahask, Lishmer Lumid, Lalamed, Lishmer Velasas, L'kayim, Eskadivri, Salmud, Teresecha, Ba'ava. And they throw in a line and they say, that's taka why our tatas, our zedas, our Visenu, Zriza Makdimim, they would push their kids to already start learning Gemara, and they didn't finish Mikra. This is a famous issue, maybe we'll touch on it later. Because Gemara is so important, because it's so central, because Mikra is really paving the way to Gemara, so you want to start Gemara as soon as possible, and therefore there's no set time for Eschalas Gemara, but it's up to the Avis and the Malamdim Hamumchim to determine when the child is ready, whenever the child's mature enough, according to the Derech HaChinuch, HaYosher, V'HaKosher, if the child taka is b'chlal shayach to Gemara, but back then taka, they still had a bit more of a yisoi, that if you see that the child is not shayach to Gemara, they don't, so maybe they skip it, they don't even bother bringing him to the Gemara Malamed, or they tried and didn't work. So then at least you have the Torah of Yom Ksuvim that you learned, the Kedushas Hamun of Adas, at least will be a kosher Yid, and you can learn halachas from Ketzah Shulchan Aruch, and you can look in the Musar Sfarim and be an Eved Hashem, Shem Mitzvah V'Amunah, B'Toim, Kefi Koichavi D'Yasei, and the way you were taught and became accustomed from the Malamdim. So there are some general points, also some interesting incidental points of how they acknowledge certain details of how the Alta Chinuch worked. So that's number one. That's one Yisrael. The second Yisrael is the Malamdim have to be good Malamdim, and the Malamdim have to be training them in the mitzvahs, Birchas HaNenen, answering Amen, Amen Yishmei Rabba, Tefillin, Tilas Yadayim. That's also part of the Malamid's job. You can't just have a modern, sterile educational system where you're just teaching topics. Part of the Malamid's job is to inculcate them with Torah mitzvahs. And number three, Kashem shemitzvah kol adam l'kbay itim l'Torah. Just like you need to set time for Torah, as man kriyash matfilah b'tzibur, there's a mitzvah v'chayva od yoyser kol echad lahakdish eis mi'yitosav lefakeach or lahashkiach b'chinuch bana. Very interesting, because in Chabad we know this thought, this idea from Hayom Yom. If you could ever mention it, maybe the Rebbe Rashab also mentioned it. So here you see that this was being expressed at a pretty early point in this kunshas from Tafir Samach Beis, that the gedolim were coming out and saying that a person has to spend time, put time towards thinking about the child's chinuch to make sure they're following the chinuch of Avesinu v'Rabbiseinu. And presumably when the Frierdiker Rebbe said it, he also sort of meant it in this kind of context when the whole question of chinuch was in question. That the outcome, the path a child would go on could be drastically different depending on some decisions made along the way. Today, the Yom Yom is probably interpreted in other ways to think about the child's emotional well-being, etc., etc. But b'makar, I think it was to make sure more generally that they ended up on the frum path and not on the non-frum path. Obviously, today, taking care and thought, putting thought into the child's emotional well-being, etc., could also contribute and ensure that they remain on the frum path. But back then it was more technical and direct. You had to think to make sure that the child's going to get the right chinuch. And parents have to look out for malamed she'enei hagon, again, today, I've mentioned this before, today we've sort of fallen into, most Jews are sort of set in their ways, belong to a community. There isn't a lot of fluctuation in that kind of way. Whereas back then, obviously, there was one big bilbul. So you could have two shtetlach, and in one shtetl, the Talmud Torah gets modernized, and in the other shtetl, lavdafka, sort of depending on a variety of factors. So two Yidden who are more or less identical to each other, one of them could have their kid end up in a very modern cheder that ends up going off, and the other one could have his kid in a traditional cheder. So this is obviously a big part of who they're addressing and why they're addressing people in this way. Because of how much everything was in flux at that time. That was point number 3, to take the time and the effort to make sure that they're going to the right chinuch. And number 4, they're also addressing the mothers, and actually it's saying that you should take the time to explain it to the mothers and to the hamoin, to do outreach, and explain that chinuch hayashiv hakasher is going to determine the Yiddishkeit of the children. It's also mitzvah the magidim and the darshanim to darshan about this, and the schos, the mitzvah gedolim v'shinantam, so beishtein, the kol hamadrichim is b'neiim b'darka shel Torah. Here the words b'darka shel Torah are in bold. And shbin niskayim b'chol b'nayach modei Hashem Rav Shalom b'noyach, and you have a list of signatures again, the same. Reb Eliyah Feinstein Prushan, the whole list again. I'm not going to read the list. Interestingly, under Reb Chaim Berlin's name, there's an asterisk, and there's only he, of that list of Rabbanim, he gets a quote that he sent a letter, and he said, he signed it Chaim Nissen, so this gives us actually a sense of when these letters were written, when this was printed. So his letter is signed Chaim Nissen, he says, Kedaihu, Kedushas Inyan Hagad V'Kadosh Hazeh, L'chal of Kedushas HaMoyed, I want to join this campaign, etc. But as I said, so there are many, like I said, there are larger points, there are smaller points, but I in particular, I am interested in the question of skipping parshas because they're inappropriate, and I will get to that soon and focus on it more directly, but now we're still going through the kuntras. So at the end, you have letters from his gedolim, I'm only going to focus on the letters that touch on this point of skipping. Grada, letter number 5, Reb Chaim Brisker, is Grada, a pretty long letter. So those who are Reb Chaim Brisker enthusiasts should definitely find this interesting if they're not already familiar with it. But I don't think it mentions skipping, so we're also going to skip it. However, the last 2 letters, letter number 7 and 8, do actually mention this point, so I will mention them as well. The 7th letter is from Rabbi Yosef Shlufer of Slonim. I might not be pronouncing his name correctly, I apologize. But he's one of the Rabbanim HaGoinim who gets to have a letter printed. And he does mention it both in sort of the beginning and describing the terrible matzav. Afal teira seinu haksuva sholchu yad, ki gam machmishachum sheteiru kartsu keret, with a saf and with a samach, which was an old Charedish avart, that the Bati Sefer Misukanim with the saf are really Misukanim with the samach. So he seems to be alluding to the fact that they ripped up the Chumash, they're not teaching it, Velois Darim, they're not teaching it in the correct order, plus the methods and all that. And he says, we know that there was a darach of how to do it, and what's going on. So then he concludes and he says, we have to turn to the fathers and announce in the Bati Knesses, the Bati Midrashas, Ki ein odem yetzi de chivasi b'adrach hazban v'talmud Torah, em loy yilamdum yilmadum b'tchilas limudoi kol chamisha chumshei HaTorah in Pirush Rashi kefi shalomdum aviseinu b'breishis ad le'eni kol Yisrael mebli ledaleg af al pasuk echad v'af al ois achas v'leimor chalila zeh noah v'zeh einei noah. No, kulam ahuvim kulam arevim mesukim edvash v'neifes tzufim. So you see him very explicitly directing his ire, making this specific point that has to be Kol Chamisha Chumshei Torah from Bereishis till Le'eni Kol Yisrael, not skipping a pasuk, not a letter, not to say Zeh v'Zeh Einei Noah. They're all Ahuvim, they're all Arevim, Mesukim, they're all Zis. So he makes this point, and also the last one of the Rogatchover also seems to be mamash on this point. The letter is from the Rogatchover. It's dated Erev Shabbos Kodesh Chafei Nisan Tavish Samach Beis Kibalti HaKuntris Darka Shel Torah. Zok the Rogatchover. V'hine kvar eshavti b'zev. Already responded. I've already made this point previously. Kal pi din Geder kadmenenu hu sh'lashanos shum davar afleti noikis. That's pasha the din, a geder, that we don't change anything even for children. And he also points to this sugya in Megillah about being matargem and not being matargem. And he points that there's a lashon of the Tosefta there, that the whole discussion in the Mishnah about certain portions that you don't read, you're not matargem, which, as we'll see, some maskilim did cite these sources as perhaps supporting their contention. But the Rebbe Rashab, who was a big bucky in Tosefta, points out that actually in Tosefta it says that even the ones that maybe you don't read, but the Tosefta says, Aval ha-sofer melamed kedarke. The sofer, which is a kunit from melamed, is melamed kedarke. So the Tosefta says clear that this whole sugya of some parshas which are skipped, which in the Kuntres cheder they pointed out that there were even other ones that are seemingly inappropriate, and that says not to skip, and that's not the concern, that's not the issue. But the Rebbe Rashab points out that ha-sofer melamed kedarke. And he's mitzayin to a few more mekaymis in this inyan. But as you see, this was like a sugya to the Rebbe Rashab, and the Rebbe Rashab had a very clear mahalach in the sugya that lefi chazal, lefi the mekayis kumtois, that there's no such thing as skipping in the context of being melamed tinaikas. And with that, that's pretty much it in terms of what this country says. Which, so now, if you go back to what we quoted from the Rebbe Rashab, the Rebbe Rashab is talking about this is maimer, this cheveres, and it's talking against the methods. So essentially, the Rebbe Rashab is referring to in part to this taina as well of chopping up the Torah and skipping around. And we'll get to soon, there's another letter of the Rebbe Rashab where the Rebbe Rashab refers to this explicitly from a few years earlier. So we still have a lot to get to here, and I'm not sure we'll get to everything. We'll see, I guess, as we go along. I'll just point out that there's no overt author's name on this kuntres, but I saw a few places where they attribute it to Yaakov Lipshitz, and even the Rebbe Rashab's Igaris is very clear that this Maimer Cheveres was associated with the Lishkin Kavna, so that was Yaakov Lipshitz, so perhaps he's talking the Mechaber of this Kuntres Cheveres. I didn't see clear that it's him, but I guess it's reasonable to assume it's him. As I said earlier, this Cheveres was reprinted a few times in the decades that followed, and today there are a number of compilations on matters of chinuch that have reproduced the kuntres, the text of the kuntres, or quoted or referred to it, so it still is somewhat known, yedua liyodim. And now let's zoom out a bit and explain, I guess here's where I would give my introduction as to why I find this topic interesting. So this is where I'm coming from on this topic, why I find it interesting, and why I said that this topic goes back to my childhood. So in my childhood, we're not going to name the names of moistus. We're not here, it's not focused at any one particular moisid. I'm just speaking about my experience. So in my experience, and this could change, this could depend based on the year, based on the Rebbe, but the way it worked in the moisid in which I learned, so children in first grade, usually, maybe occasionally in P1A they start, but usually first grade you start from the beginning of Bereshis. And then over the course of, I believe, first, second, and third, you're supposed to complete Bereshis. However, the Metzias is that during that time, one does not conclude the entire Sefer Bereshis, but rather there is some skipping involved. This is not what my recollection is not directly from that time. I'm sort of reconstructing, but Lamer Zogin, that when I was in first grade, perhaps we learned Bereshis Noach, and maybe Takalech Lecha, maybe we skipped Vayera, and then maybe second we did Chayesara told us maybe part of Vayetze, or let's say we skipped Vayishlach Vayeshav, and then in third grade we did Bekates Vayigash Vayechi. That's be'erech. Don't quote me on it exactly, but something like that. And I remember specifically that my mother, who spent a lot of time with my chinuch when I was growing up, so she made a point of learning those skipped parshas with me in the summers in between. So between first grade and second grade, we did Vayera, and between second and third grade, I guess, we did Vayishlach and Vayetze. Now, Vayera has the story of B'nai Slight, the destruction of Sedoim, and therefore the Maisa of B'nai Slight. And Vayishlach has the Maisa of Dinah, and Vayeshav has the Maisa of Yehuda and Tamar. So the question is, was this fully mamish b'kavana? Was the Maisid intending to skip these parshas for this reason? Or was it sort of technically, well, we're trying to finish Bereshis during this time, and if you got to it, you got to it. Oh, you didn't get to it, okay, whatever. But now we'll continue where you ought to be up to. Hard to know exactly. It feels like it couldn't have been completely an accident that it was set up like this. And Mamela, those parshas were skipped, and I ended up learning with my mother. I don't remember that there was any major issue with learning it. Obviously, even when we learned it, she didn't go out of her way to make it explicit. You teach it, however you teach it. There are ways to teach it, and a kid at that age, even if it doesn't compute 100%, but there are all kinds of things that are not computing, and it's always funny to hear how kids understand things and misunderstand things at a very young age. So lo nora if they misunderstand, slightly misunderstand another thing. Obviously, we can get into that question as to whether that's okay educationally. But let's assume that it's okay to sort of farteich it a little bit, but at least to learn the psukim, at least to know the story. And as the Kuntra says, really part of the goal is to be teaching the lessons and the Musar and Yireh Shamayim, and it's not supposed to be just reaching dry educational objectives, but there's supposed to be a lesson. It sounds like a Maligim Malamdim or certain Malamdim today still have that kayach, that chush of focusing on the lessons and Yiddishkeit. So that's where I'm coming from, and it's something I still clearly remember to some extent, to the extent that I could sort of tell you roughly, broadly, what we skipped and what we learned. So that was the Maisa then. And then in the coming grades, so you learn a little bit of Shmois, and then a little bit of Vayikra. I think not the beginning of Vayikra, maybe more like the Achrei, Kedoshim, Emor, somewhere in that whereabouts. There's a lot of jumping around, a little, or I think in fourth grade is a little Bamidbar. So now I'm thinking, when do they do Shmois? I don't know. Maybe it moves around, maybe it changes. I think in fourth grade we did Dafka Bamidbar, Nase Ba'aloischa, and then over there I think we skipped. I think we skipped the Parsha of Saita, and there that was the clearest Itaka came. I wasn't even thinking about this before I started recording, but now it's coming back to me. I think that was the clearest that we came to mamish skipping something. That we're looking at a chumash and we're skipping a parsha. So that actually happened. Now that I'm thinking about it, I think we skipped parsha Saita. So I think we did Bamidbar Nase Ba'aloischa, and then in fifth grade, maybe fifth and sixth grade I don't remember. Seventh grades we were doing the end of Vayikra. Achgadashim Emor. I remember Dafka over there. There's some psukim there describing some of the mumim and some of the private parts, and there we did do the psukim, and there the kids were tittering and laughing a little bit, and that also stuck in my mind. So these are all things that stuck in my mind. I also remember that in sixth grade we were learning Baba Kama, and in Baba Kama there is a Mishnah, a fal that's a bit explicit, like a nezek that happens b'shas tashmish. And the Rebbe skipped that, and the kids noticed that he skipped it, and they at that point already, I don't know if we want to give physical terms to it, but at that point in sixth grade, kids are 11, they're a little bit more hormonal, if you want to say, or whatever you want to call it. But the kids did pick up on it, and they already were sort of aware that I guess it must be something that's not 100% appropriate about it. Oh, why'd you skip it? Tell us why you skipped it. So there was a bit of that. So all these things I've still stuck in my mind till now. And how many memories do I have of each year? How many concrete, specific memories that I could tell you? But and yet I could remember. I remember these specific things. So clearly there is no objective of finishing Chumash cheder, and clearly there are parshas and bereshis, where it's like the foundational, fundamental stories of the Avos and of Klal Yisrael, and yet entire parshas, including the more the trickier stories were skipped, and then so there's no goal of finishing Chumash cheder. There's definitely skipping, whether b'chalal parshas or inappropriate stuff, if you want to call it that. So this is the reality. And now with having grown up and my kids sort of going through a similar system, so what they're encountering is feels like it's not that different. Although, like I said, it depends on the Rebbe. And some Rebbes cover more in a year. Now they have the classes divided sort of informally by skill level. So if you're on a higher level in that class with that Rebbe, so you do end up getting further. So Lav Dafka, they're all being medayik to skip. And it could be my class on average was a bit shvach back then. So it could be the Taka went slower. It could be that's where they didn't get to some of the material that they may have otherwise gotten to. But it would be interesting to know whether they would have skipped it back then. And I'm not even 100% sure now if they are skipping or not skipping, or if different Rebbes are doing different things. But I think there certainly are gaps. Whether or not they get up to Vayera, whether they skip the story or not, I would have to double check. or Vayishlach or Vayeshev, but I'm still pretty sure that most kids, most of the time, are not finishing the whole Bereshis. There is some skipping involved. So, and then the jumping, Bamidbar Vayikra, that hasn't really changed. So that's the reality, that's the Mitzvah. So this has always been a question to me as to whether this is correct, this is appropriate, and the two sides of the argument are, on the one hand, it's maybe not appropriate for kids that age, on the other hand, it's cheder, and why are you saying that cheder is inappropriate? Years later, but already at this point a long time ago, came across is a famous letter of the Tzemach Tzedek. And as we see, these educational wars, specifically within Russia, date back to the time of the Tzemach Tzedek, and you had Lilienthal and the camp of sort of radical maskilim, who were a much smaller minority at the time, who were pushing to modernize the educational system and have a modern curriculum. And you have the Tzemach Tzedek pushing back, fighting back, and you can look in the Divrei Hayom Mehem to see what they ended up being matzliach to do or not matzliach to do, but it seems ultimately at that time, only a relatively small percentage of Jewish children ended up in their institutions, although that number was probably set to keep growing. And then you had the next wave of different isms, including Zionism, and the kuntras that we just read seems to be sort of directed in particular at Zionism and those circles who would have been enthusiastic about the Lashon HaKodesh, focusing on the language, and in that sense, so they were modernizing the Jewish educational system with an eye towards certain Zionist, secular Zionist values at that time. So the Tzemach Tzedek in his era was confronting this question of whether, so there's a letter that he wrote that's addressed, I believe, not to Lilienthal, but to someone else by the name of Mandelstam, if I'm not mistaken, Leon Mandelstam, and he is directly addressing the proposal to make textbooks. The textbooks will be selected parshias of the Torah, selected parts of Rambam, and so on. And the Tzemach Tzedek is answering one by one as to why it's not a good idea. And with regards to the Psukim, so there's a passage there which I could say that at this point is perhaps even, you could say, famous, in which the Tzemach Tzedek writes, Barichas, I'm not going to quote it, I'm not going to have it in front of me. To me, this is already an alta yedias. The Tzemach Tzedek says that Chas v'Shalom, you have to read the whole entire Torah from beginning to end, and if you skip the story of Reuben and Bilhah, and then you're going to get to Vayechi, and it says Pachas Kamayim Al Toisar, and it's referring back to that, and you're not going to know what it's referring to, and all the drashas of Chazal are based on Smuchim, so the Torah is one unit, you can't skip around. So this question already came up back then, and then already back then the maskilim, these cheder, they printed textbooks, and they put the Tzemach Tzedek's name on them, and it's a whole parsha. I think Rebbe Mordechai Dinneman recorded something about one of these textbooks. Maybe he was focusing more on a Rambam textbook, but he has talked about it, I remember. And so there's this question, did the Tzemach Tzedek agreed that his name should be put on it, even though he was clearly opposed to it and wouldn't have recommended that anyone use it or not? That's a separate parsha. I'm also aware that Rebbe Baruch Oberlander of Hungary has written on this topic, and he wrote Bechlal about the different storim and chadarim, and he writes about how in the Chassidish Welt till today they Bechlal have a different cheder, limud Chumash. Their cheder is that they learn that week's parsha for that week, and I guess lacheder at a very young grade in first grade, so you start from the beginning of the parsha, and by the time the week goes by, how far did you get in? I don't know, one aliyah, two aliyahs. And the older you get, the further you get through the parsha, I guess through 8th grade, I'm assuming. I'm not speaking as an authority, I'm not familiar firsthand. But he writes about it, and I've seen plenty of other references to it from the Chassidish Welt today. So that's the Seder. So then Vayechi comes, and they learn the famous Nusach from Vayechi, V'aniyunach Yaakov, and Hamalach Hagoya with the Yiddish, and the Berachas Yaakov with the Yiddish. When they get to Mishpatim for them is a big deal. To learn all the Rashis, to learn the Mishpatim is like the first serious parsha of Torah Shebal Peh, and it's packed with dinim Torah Shebal Peh. So there's like a Messiah that you have to learn Mishpatim with the Rashis and know it very well. And apparently in the Chassidish Welt there's also some trauma that goes along with it. The Vayechi, the Berachas Yaakov isn't so geschmack for the kids, and the Mishpatim isn't so geschmack for the kids. And lately some of the Chassidish singers have been making songs about their trauma about it. No, we're not going to get into that. But so that seems to be their state. And there's a Messiah, there's definitely Madar Makaitis, the subject of chinuch, the Ifania chinuch, is really a huge body of literature, and there are svarim that are malakit this literature, and anyone who has an interest in chinuch and wants to have an opinion on chinuch, in my opinion, you have to go through these makaidas. I myself ought to go through them even more than I have already, because everything we do today is ultimately building on Messiahs, and sometimes you know about it, and sometimes you don't even know about it. The Sidrei Yeshiva and the Yeshiva Gedolim as well, the Sidrei Limud Gemara, everything about the Sidrei Limud, even if we've changed things to some extent in the last 100 years, ultimately it's building on hundreds of years of tradition. That's the Metzias. As long as you're within a Haredi world, there are Messiahs that are either whether visible or invisible, but they're there. That govern and affect dozens of points of dozens of aspects of what we learn and how we learn and the schedule and all kinds of things you never thought about. They all are shaped by this invisible history. So it's really important to be familiar and to be acquainted and to know about it. So I was saying they have Makaidas for how they, and I think Rebbe Rashab quoted some of these Makaidas to do it this way, to do it that way. Are you going through let's say they're starting from the beginning and going straight, or are you doing like a cycle every year? And are you taka finishing Gans Chumash or not? It's not fully clear if historically every child taka finished Chumash or not, even though at this point in this polemical context there seems to be the stance of Gans Chumash. And I think in that context, Rebbe Rashab sort of alludes to the Tzemach Tzedek. He raises this question of skipping. He quotes the Tzemach Tzedek and he says, Lav Dafka Tzemach Tzedek meant it 100%. Could be that's just responding to the maskilim. You don't want to give them a foothold, so they want to go one extreme, you go the other extreme, and that's sort of what he suggests. But there are some quotes from the Rebbe on this question. Maybe we'll get to that shortly. But that's his take. Now, I've always been troubled by that take because I've suggested, and I think I mentioned this in a recent recording in the last few weeks, that there's actually a genre within the Tzemach Tzedek's writing, and it hasn't been fully identified by others, that there are a number of tshuvas of the Tzemach Tzedek responding to pushes for change. The big tshuva about beards in year to day, in my opinion, is really a defensive response to pushes for change, to the Gzeres HaMalbushim, which included the talk about the beard. And the Tzemach Tzedek is trying to defend and explain why, even though in halach it seems like it may be mutter to touch the beard, but if the government's going to come and tell us what to do in opposition to the Eastern European minig for hundreds of years not to touch the beard, so I'm going to have to come up with a framework to explain why it's usher to touch the beard, which hadn't been come up with before. But it's in response to you want to change it, so then I have to stand up for our Messiah and explain why it's dafka zoy nicht anders. And there are the tshuvas about the Malbushim themselves, and I've argued, and I've recorded shirim on this, and I've argued that people misinterpret the Tzemach Tzedek's tshuva on it, and the Tzemach Tzedek's maskana was that you cannot change the Malbushim, and then he wrote another tshuva about the Mesiras Nefesh, and his argument was that you have to be Mesiras Nefesh and Malbushim. The final catch at the end is that they're not giving us the choice to be Mesiras Nefesh. They say that if you don't change the Malbushim, they'll recruit you into the army, and in the army you'll be unable to keep even more mitzvahs. So Hayos, they're not giving us the option of Yeharik Vayaver. So he fears us they're not 100% that okay, maybe we don't have a choice. So that the Tzemach Tzedek Be'etzem was, if you had to map the responses of Rabbanim, the Rebbe Nechemia was a lot more open to touching the beard, to changing the Malbushim. Because if you look in halacha, it's not so clear where what the lines are. Just because we did things a certain way for a few hundred years, does that mean that it's a din, a chiyuv, a hechech? So the Rebbe Nechemia is more liberal on these questions. The Tzemach Tzedek, if you had to map where the Tzemach Tzedek is on the map, definitely more in the corner of standing up for tradition and nothing should change. But depending on the situation, as to what the Metzias was, and with Malbushim in particular, that's where there was less resistance in terms of responding to the Malbushim and updating and changing the Malbushim a bit, and that's its own whole topic, the history of Jewish Malbushim and Eastern European Jewish Malbushim in the last 300 years. So I've argued that this is a genre within the Tzemach Tzedek's writing, and therefore this letter about Chinuch also belongs to that genre, and in this case, it's clearly addressed. We know who it's addressed to and what it's in response to directly. So within that pattern, the Tzemach Tzedek is always standing up for the tradition, and it seems like the tradition was that you don't skip, and the maskilim want to skip for their modern Western reasons, and the Tzemach Tzedek is standing up for the Messiah and saying you can't change the Messiah, and there was a real Messiah. That was my taina already going back a while. But here, this kuntras, Darka Shal, which I only encountered this week, seeing the Rebbe Rashab's letter and looking at the kuntras, this provides additional valuable context, which I don't think he was aware of and that he quoted. Like I said, most are not familiar. It's not widely quoted. It's quoted by some, but many others don't quote it. This provides additional context that a few decades later, Tzemach Tzedek is the 1840s. This is already like 60 years later. That this was still an ongoing thing. That throughout this time, the siman heker of maskilim, changing education, was skipping, and the siman heker of traditional education was not skipping. Now, did they actually learn Kol Chamishim Shetera from Bereshis Al Ein Kol Yisrael? I don't know for sure. That's still not clear to me. If that mamish happened, would also seemingly depend on which seder halimud they followed. This kuntras itself mentions that they don't wait for them to finish Chumash and they start Gemara. So if they don't finish Chumash, they start Gemara. So do they ever finish Chumash? Not clear to me. Maybe it's if you didn't skip to Gemara class, then maybe you did finish Chumash. But if you didn't skip, then you finished. And if you did skip, maybe you didn't finish. Not fully clear to me. And looking at the larger corpus of chinuch material might address this question. But there was certainly no skipping. That seems very clear that there was no such thing among the charedim of skipping, and from this kuntras and also and throughout the kuntras a number of times it's very clear that to them it was a completely foreign thing and would never have occurred to them to do it, and it was the maskilim and tziyonim and all the mischadshim that kept on coming with this time that no, we need to skip, and they didn't know how to eat it. Vi esmen this taina, and adrabah, it strengthened, hardened their determination to stick to the Messiah. Our Messiah is that we don't skip. So if they say to skip, so we say don't skip. So this is, and the Rebbe Rashab, while not directly mentioning it directly in this letter about it, but the Rebbe Rashab is meshabeach, this kuntras is standing up for traditional chinuch, and that includes this point as well. So it's not just Tzemach Tzedek out of context, but rather, very clearly, this was, you talk about traditional chinuch, traditional Messiah, the Messiah of chinuch, this was a clear point of contention where the Messiah was, you don't skip. Now, it is important to mention that there is a distinction. There are levels here. Part of what the criticism was, already going back to the Tzemach Tzedek, was that the maskilim and those following this derech tended to want to actually create Chumash textbooks and shortened Chumashim, and to skip in that way. And that has a mile and a chesaron, because if you use a regular Chumash, so the kids see that you're skipping, so that itself could be taken negatively by the kids. Either they could think it's funny, or adrabah, you're teaching them that there are parts that you're supposed to skip, or that there are parts of the cheder that are not appropriate. So you can get around that by making a shortened Chumash. By making a shortened Chumash, in a way, it's much worse. That you're chopping up the Chumash into pieces. So when we have this discussion, we do have to keep in mind that these are two separate but related, interlocking points. Tzemach Tzedek, for instance, was focusing a lot on the textbook point as well, but he's also referring to the learning. And this kuntras is focusing more on the learning, but perhaps also alluding to the fact that they may be printing. I don't think it says clearly, but if you knew the context at the time, it may have been implied that this was possible, this was the case. In the oifen of skipping, as I described, so first of all, they're using real chumashim, so at least for that. And if you sort of skip it between one zman and the next zman, so it's not as noticeable. But like I said, at least in one case, I do remember that we skipped chelik of a parsha, that was a milva parsha, and I remember skipping a chelik of the Gemara, that was in the Gemara. So that does happen sometimes, but so we have to be honest and fair about ranking these different levels and dargas of skipping as well. So that's important. Now I have a list here of potential additional avenues to sort of shtel zich on. For example, Sfarim that talk about this question today about skipping, but I don't think we have time for it. There's also a kuntras Shari Tzion, which is like a follow-up kuntras. The secular, or whatever you want to call it, the left-leaning press at the time, versteht sich, mocked this kuntras darka shel Torah, and they tied it that it's shaloi kafi amitas shel Torah. So someone wrote a kuntras Shari Tzion in Tavish Ayin Aleph, behemshich to that, but I don't think we have time to get into that either. One interesting thing that I noticed is that there's been this whole controversy in the last few years about this new chibur pshita shel mikra, like a charedim put out, like a modern pirush ala Torah of choosing what the pshat is, and that's gotten a lot of pushback. So I noticed that one of the kunteresim bashkavilin against it actually cites the darka shel Torah on their side, that you have to follow the traditional pirushim, Rashi and the Mefarshim, and you have to find that balance of pshat and Torah Shebal Peh. You can't make your own new pirushim, so that's an interesting application. And in the Rogatchover, there's actually a much longer letter of the Rogatchover. It's printed in Kisser by Isaac Shvei and in other places, in the new Shut Sofnes Panecha Chadashis Chelik Beis, from Tafish Ayin Hey, I think, and it's to Rabbi Shua of Velij, and they don't say who it is, but I wanted to point out that it's Rabbi Shua Nemoiten, however you pronounce his name, who was a Chabad Rav. And the Rogatchover writes a much longer letter to him about this point, about not skipping, but there I think the focus is talking more on not printing a shortened version of the Chumash. That's Mamish, Shemu Shemayim, the Rogatchover writes Barichis. So like I said, there are both points. And the Rogatchover here, in this letter, the short one, in this kuntrus, Taka seems to be focusing more on the teaching rather than the printing. So like I said, you have to keep the two questions apart. But that is also another thing we could have gone off onto to focus on, but we're not going to due to time constraints. As I alluded to, if you search the newspapers of that time, you search for Darka Shel Torah, you will find references, mentions. Interestingly, I found in one issue of Hamelitz of November 1902, they mentioned there was also apparently a Yiddish version, like a Yiddish cheder version of that cheveres. And the article is mocking it, and the article actually quotes that in that Yiddish cheder, which it mocks, it's in the old Yiddish, the old language of Galus. So in that cheder, it also mentioned nicht gehuppert kein parshias in the Torah. So of all the, I don't know how long the cheder was, and I don't know if any copies of it have been preserved. It's not every, it's called ephemera, just an ephemeral piece of paper. Not every piece of paper gets preserved. So I don't know if there's a copy. I looked a little bit, didn't see. But of all things that they quote from the cheder, it's weiter this point of nicht gehuppert, which clearly means not skipping, came parshas in the Torah. That's the traditional, that's the correct way. And that article is responding to that and making fun of that. As we'll see, when the press at the time would respond to it, they would partially say it's not a problem, perhaps, and partially deny that it's happening at all. So instead of going off on all those inyanim that I mentioned that we could have, and I have a stack of papers just in case, but I'm going to go and focus on an additional letter of the Rebbe Rashab that completes this picture. And I was reminded of this because Mordechai Dinneman, about 5 years ago, did a series on Chabad and Zionism. It's not out in the public, but B'Seich Dvarav, he mentioned, he was going through the letters of Rebbe Rashab against Zionis, and he mentioned there's a taka, letter of Rebbe Rashab, about skipping or about cutting the Chumash. And at the time, he asked for more information, whoever has more information, and I took up the challenge at the time, and I found my old discussion with him. So I want to share some of that because it complements this discussion here. And it shows that the Rebbe Rashab was, just like this kuntrus, was reacting to this phenomenon, and he associated it as one of the sins of Zionism. So if you look in the Rebbe Rashab's early letter against Zionism from Tafish Nun Tes, 1899, it was printed in a kuntrus early Yesharim, and now it's an Igros Kodesh of the Rebbe Rashab Chelik Aleph, at the first series, Igeres number 86. So the Rebbe Rashab there attacks the Zionists on different fronts and different angles. So one of the tainus is that the people running it are menagdim gemurim l'Hashem u'l'Torah, meaning in addition to taking direct issue with the question of Eretz Yisrael, Zionism, but the people running it are opponents of Hashem and His Torah, and their whole point is to lifrik or Torah v'hamitzvahs, and all they want is le'umiyas, the nationalism, and that will be their Yiddishkeit. He quotes different rayas, and he says this is what they're trying to get. This is what they're trying to teach the children. That's why they're aiming at the chinuch. That's why they're aiming at the educational system. They want to capture all the schools, and that way they can inculcate the children with poison of kfira and Torah mitzvahs, and to only believe in nationalism. The Rebbe Rashab says, "V'chasher hey is echad mirosheim Lasis Torah Chadasha, V'hu Chamisha Chumshei Torah, Loi Kamoshe Nimsar L'Moshe Misinai, Ki Im Dileg Habi Psukim Habi Parshas V'dinim Asher Lo Yoshru Be'enov, V'yoder Netuy Lahatpis HaTorah HaChadasha HaZois, V'zeh Yilmudu Min Ha'arim B'vatei HaSefer. One of their leaders dared make a Torah Chadasha, which is the Chumash, but not as is given to Moshe Sinai. Rather, he skipped many psukim, many parashas, and did them that he didn't like, and he's about to print it, and that's what they're going to use as a textbook. They're going to teach the children in the Bati Sefer, and the Zionist Bank is going to start schools to teach them in this way. So how terrible this is. So Rabbi Dittman was asking at the time, what is the Rebbe Rashab reacting to? So at the time, I looked through the newspapers, and I found that in 1899, Hamelitz, a left-leaning newspaper, described a local controversy in Pinsk over someone who had composed a work like this. But they claimed it wasn't meant to replace the Chumash, but just to be used as a learning aid. But the local rabbis made it into a huge issue over the author's Zionist ties, and they claimed it's forbidden to shorten the Torah. This was reported in Hamelitz. A second piece from 1900 quotes the Rebbe Rashab's letter, which had now come out, and links it back to this Pinsk incident, and it's disrespectful towards Rebbe Rashab, both for suggesting that this person is a Zionist leader, that's Stam a no one, Stam some guy in Pinsk, and Sai, at the same time, for having a problem with the work. What's your problem with the work? And then there's another article that also quotes the Rebbe Rashab's letter and claims that he's making the whole thing up, but that article may not have been aware of what happened in Pinsk, and if the second article was correct, that it was more of a local incident in Pinsk, and the Rebbe Rashab took it and put it as a centerpiece of his tinus about Zionism, but maybe people beyond Pinsk Taka hadn't heard about it. So at that time, newspapers were able to laugh at it and say, what are you talking about? The Metzias is that whether or not it was the official agenda of the Zionists at the time, but it very quickly certainly became part of the agenda. We know in particular that Chaim Nachum Bialik was very involved, instrumental in printing a shortened Chumash, which he believed was the right thing to do, b'shita. So it doesn't stem with the timing of the Rebbe Rashab. The Rebbe Rashab couldn't have been referring to his project, but it came very quickly, and in the long term, of course, the Rebbe Rashab was diagnosing the Metzias correctly, in that this is something the Zionists would be likely to do. And ad etzem hayom hazeh, those who have written about it, the secular Israeli educational system only teaches the children some very selective, chopped up version of Chumash, all along the lines of what the Kuntris that we quoted earlier is describing, and along the lines of what the Rebbe Rashab is describing. So this, of course, was very much along the lines of what the Zionists were up to, and it was correct to diagnose it this way and to call them out for it. Whether or not that example from Pinsk was the best example at that particular moment in time. Now, when I went back to find that discussion, I noticed that I had also linked to an article on the topic. So as it turns out, there's a fellow, Dati Lumi Mizrachnik, as we say, in Israel. His name is Ari Yitzchak Shevet, and he wrote a 3-part series on Diluk Prakim Belimud Tanakh v'Hatalmud Im Yeladim Etayim Tznius. And he's writing this as a religious Zionist, so his whole angle is that as a Zionist, but as religious, we need to figure out the right balance of, we have to follow the Messiah and follow what the Torah says, but also what's appropriate for the Zionist youth in our day. So he's coming from his own interesting angle. But he did a 3-part series. He claimed that he was the first one to do a research project that's encompassing this entire subject. But interestingly, he actually apparently was not aware of this Kuntris Darka Shel Torah. So it goes to show that even someone who wrote so much on it could be missing this pretty important piece of information. So certainly our series here, our recording here, is calling attention to a very important source that has not been sufficiently examined. By the way, I'm reminded, one of the points I wanted to mention is that interestingly in Chabad today there's a whole controversy over, and speaking of methods, another related controversy is how to teach the Aleph Beis and the Nekudas, Kamat Aleph. I'm not going to get into it. But a few years ago there was a controversy that one of the more Charedishim Alamdim within Chabad had gone digging into the maskilim's textbooks for teaching Aleph Beis 100 years ago or so, and he was trying to prove that some of the shinuyim and updates within the Frum world today actually bring those methods as well closer in line with what the maskilim were trying to do versus what the traditional method was. And in response to that, one of the big Chabad Rabbanim counterattacked him for studying maskilic texts, which, okay, it seems like a little bit of a, I don't know what to say, how to describe that. It's reminds me a bit lahavdil of when someone makes an analogy to the Holocaust, and then they get counterattacked for quoting the Holocaust, as if like by quoting it you're endorsing it. That's clearly not the case here. The person looking at the Makairos wasn't endorsing the maskilim, and to say that looking up the maskilim's textbooks is therefore bad because you're looking at what maskilim said, it seems a bit funny. But there are parallels here, and there is this question, as I wanted to get to, as to whether in today's day and age we need to stick 100% to what the Masada was and investigate every single shinu the maskilim we're in favor of and make sure we don't make any such change, or whether from the Rebbe we can derive and deduce that it's not 100% azai. So I do want to get to that, but I'm reminded of that Tzushtal as well. In this case, this article, part of what this article does is it does research what many maskilim and Zionists were saying and advocating in the context for that, and I do think the context is important. Whether or not we are trying to take a kainoish sort of all or nothing approach, which is not necessarily our intention, but I do want to be ma'ir, and I do think it's valuable in the case of the Comment Alpha as well to have clarity as to what the shittas were at that time and what the stances were, and when they were being moicha against the new shittas, what that meant exactly. So this article, like I said, it's called Diluk Prakim B'Limud Tanach VaTalmudim Yilodim Tamei Tznius. So it covers it from a few different angles. The first article covers it in terms of taka these questions from Chazal. In some places in Chazal, there is a mashmos, that maybe certain things are inappropriate to be shared with certain people or at certain times or in certain ways. And then particularly it's this sugya and Megillah. And the person's presentation here, Barichas, basically is that if you actually learn the sugya, it says a bunch of maskilim quoted the Mishnah as if that was a makar, Bialik and others quoted the Mishnah. See, yeah, you're supposed to skip. But yet, if you learn the sugya, you'll see very clearly that it's not talking about children. And he mentions this Tosefta as well, which the Rogatchover already seized on back then. And he writes in a footnote that it could be the maskilim pashut ham gehalten that they are entitled to farteich the Mishnah differently than the Gemara and the Rishonim. So if he said it's not amaratzis, they pashut think they know the Mishnah better. Okay, shine. But if you learn the sugya with all the Makairos, it's very clear that there's no makar here to skip when teaching children. So he goes through that at a tremendous arichas, quotes the Tzemach Tzedek as well, quotes the Rebbe a little bit, and things that the Rebbe has been quoted on. Then the Chelik Beis, the first half, he talks about Christian attitudes, and I think that's actually very important and interesting. I was glad he did this work when I revisited it now, and in the process of preparing for this, I did actually sit down and I read through all the pages of these articles. It's a nice amount. So look what I'm doing to make sure that you have a well-researched, well-balanced presentation that presents all the sides and all the aspects, so you're getting the information that you can use to arrive at a well-informed conclusion. So anyway, back to his series. So in the first half of his second installment, he goes through sort of the Christian angle, and he relies on research that others have already written, I'm assuming in English, and sort of goes through where the lahavdil, you have to differentiate between the Catholic world versus the Protestant evangelical world. And as he says, it's really a completely different planet. Their link to Tanakh, to the Old Testament as they call it, is pretty weak as it is. And once these ideas came along about sheltering children, so they were much quicker to do it. Based on what he quotes, based on other research, it seems that I think non-Catholics were already censoring stories for this reason in the 1700s, and the Catholics were doing so in the 1800s. But this is definitely important, more general context to sort of give us an indication both where the maskilim and their like were coming from back then, and really also where we are coming from right now, because clearly, as I may have implied or indicated, clearly the frum world at this point does harbor similar sentiments about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. And rewinding 200 years, it seems like the maskilim were more attuned to these types of sensitivities, which are Western sensitivities. So the further back you go and the more east you go, it seems like they didn't have these sensitivities at all. And even the Hamish belt in Eastern Europe didn't have these sensitivities. And then those who were more exposed to the Western world were more sensitive to this, more attuned to this. And yet today, those in the English-speaking world, even if you identify as Haredi, were automatically more exposed to Western values. And even the Chassidish world, the Yiddish-speaking world, who are a few decades behind, but they're also slowly exposed to the same values and ideas. Ironically, today, being extreme in Yonei Tznius and including in skipping can sometimes be associated afka with more extreme, the Chassidish and the Kanoim, but clearly there's no early makar for that, and clearly one could seemingly count that also as some kind of Western influence, even if they are completely not aware of it. It could also be a backlash to some extent to the complete collapse of morality in the Western world. We can definitely point to many examples of new extreme standards in Yonei Tznius and the separation between men and women and many other such things that there clearly is no historical basis for. And I'm very, of course, very enthusiastic, very into finding historical sources and historical basis for some of the strange things or the hard to explain things that we do. So when they're doing things that don't have a makar, so then to me, is that any different than what those who are modernizing are doing? They're both modern. They're both not based on Messiah. They're both not based on tradition. So they could be equally unfounded and equally wrong, even if you believe it's coming from charediyut and kanos, but it's not real. To me, it's not real charediyut. If it's not coming, being charedi is about preserving the tradition, preserving the Messiah, preserving how things were done 200, 300, 400 years ago or more. And here you're introducing things that are that's like the etzadas. You're adding things that are not part of the Messiah. So that's where I would probably fall on that question when the charedim kanoim are changing things in this way. And ironically, as I'm pointing out, they could be really an expression of modernity, because it's only someone who has been exposed to modernity would have this sensitivity. So that's what it seems. It seems that the Western world developed this sensitivity. And I think England, those types of lands, I think tended to be less Catholic, but I don't want to start making grand pronunciations. So it could be the less Catholic countries developed the sensitivity first, and then the Catholic countries, and then the maskilim, depending on where they lived, but really from the earliest point. So Taka, in the second half of this second article, he gets into the history of the maskilim. And there's another article as well that I'll mention soon that also gets into it. But really from the earliest time that maskilim started suggesting changes to the educational system, which is maybe as early as late 1700s, this was a concern. This was a point that kept on being raised. So it's been an issue ever since then in the Jewish world. But initially this was just in Germany, Western Europe. And then slowly it starts creeping into Eastern Europe. That's the story of the maskilim, the radical maskilim who are trying to change Eastern European way of doing things. And so that's when you have the Tzemach Tzedek. And then you have the wave of Zionism. That's sort of the next wave that hits very powerfully. So this second half of the article sort of goes through many of those, but I think focusing more on the wave of Tzionim as opposed to that much earlier, which I said is really another article. Then the third section of his article talks about sort of modern attitudes within the more Zionist world, whether not religious Zionist or religious Zionist. That was, I think, the least interesting or relevant to me. Another source that I found online that discusses is actually a file from the Headlines podcast back in December 2022. Apparently they had a topic to discuss or not discuss. I didn't listen to the podcast, but I found the source sheet, and the source sheet quotes Tzemach Tzedek, Taka Ba'arichos, and it is also mitzayin to the Kunter Starker Shel Torah. So I was impressed, whoever put it together, that they were aware of that makar. And they quote a few other interesting makaris from the Maram Shik, Chassan Sofer, as to whether they did learn Nida with the Bachrim, they didn't learn Nida, Shutmar Shag. Some of the earlier ones seem to say that they did learn Nida with the Bachrim, while later the Marshag already says that they don't learn Nida with the Bachrim. So that's also an interesting element and aspect of this article focused, that Taka, the previous articles by Shevet also focused on a little bit, skipping Mesechtes, which Mesechtes learned with the Bachrim. Ksubis traditionally is part of the Sidrei HaYeshivas, And today you have elements of the Haredi world that are becoming increasingly uncomfortable with that as well. I'm not going to start naming names, but like I said, that is an example where the Messiah clearly is to learn these Masechtas, and Haredim are going against the Messiah and applying new standards of tznius that are not Yiddish standards of tznius, seemingly, but sort of out of a backlash to what they perceive to be a collapse of morality, and they're going to the opposite extreme, but with no makar. And finally, there's an article, Havikuach al Heiros Hatanach B'Deiros Achronim by Yisrael Brown, which I found on the DAT website, and there he starts even earlier with the very earliest maskilim in 1772. Yosef Levin was corresponding with the King of Prussia, and in 1778 the Beis Sefer L'Na'ar, David Friedlander, and Moses Mendelssohn's contribution, and Naftali Hertz's Wiesel, Wesley's contribution. So all of that sort of fits into this larger history and narrative of maskilim seeking to make changes in Shinoyim, and among what they were trying to do touched on this question. And from there he continues on to later Deiros, which the other article also talks about and covers. So this is some important context for where we're coming from on this matter, and perhaps I will put links to these articles in the description for the YouTube and the Spotify, etc., for those who are interested in reading more on the topic. But that is certainly an important backstory and important background towards understanding where the Tzemach Tzedek is coming from, where the Rebbe Rashab is coming from. So that is certainly, and like I said, the Rebbe Rashab in this letter here from Chai Tammuz, Tafresh Samach Beis, alluding to the Maimon Darkei cheder, and the earlier letter from Tafresh Nun Tes against the Tzionim, also making this point. I do want to make a larger point, which sort of mitigates a little bit the fact that some Haredi schools today are making some shinuyim. Before that, I do want to point out that, interestingly, the Rebbe Rashab himself, as I pointed out recently in Chassidus, the Rebbe Rashab himself is also seen to be seemingly censoring certain themes from Chassidus and not talking about certain themes in front of Bachrim, because the oilam between the Rebbe Rashab's dar and the Rebbe Rashab's dar switched from young teenagers getting married and coming and being zitzers, but technically being married and being familiar and being exposed to these inyanim, versus Bachrim who sit in yeshiva and learn till their early 20s. So the Rebbe Rashab also, to some extent, also did a version of this within Chassidus, where it seems that he stopped mentioning certain themes. So that also shows that it's not black and white and not a binary. So to add some thought and some insight to that, some framing to that, a more general point here is that it's not always so much about the technicality of skipping and not skipping, but rather there is this point of first maskilim and then tziyonim, each in their way, coming along with the premise that we need to make a break with the past, that the past is no good, we need to rethink it, we need to change it, and we need to invent a new Jew. And each wave, in their turn, clearly had this concept pretty clearly in mind, whether it was the maskilim in the late 1700s, were clearly thinking about we need a new modern Jew, and the Zionists as well, certainly the more secular you get, were thinking about reinventing what it means to be a Jew, what Judaism means. And even the religious Zionists, even someone like Rav Kook, can be classified and grouped with that crowd, to the extent that it would also seem pretty clear that he was also thinking about reinventing what it means to be a Jew, reinventing what it means to be Jewish, reinventing what it means to be a Yid in Eretz Yisrael. And it could be his ideas were very different than some of the other people's ideas, but it's still all coming from the same shoydish. Whereas to be a Haredi, by definition, means that we want to see ourselves as being the same Jew as a Yid 200 years ago. Are we identical? Are we exactly the same Jew? Are there some things that we wouldn't mind improving? Probably are some things. But it doesn't come from a mindset of, let's create a new Jew, a modern Jew. It comes from, let's continue doing what we're doing, but there always are gradual changes, incremental changes. And so the Rebbe Rashab is responding, I think rightfully so, to what was going on in his time. And obviously, as I've spoken about long ago, we're talking about Zionism, that at that point, Judaism was in such flux, and anyone could land at any side of these divides. A person raising a family, one kid could end up a chassid, one kid could end up a Zionist, one kid could end up a communist, one kid could go to America and just become a secular, assimilated Jew in America. So there was so much in flux, it was so dynamic at the time, and the Rebbe Rashab would be targeting Zionism to a much greater extent even than perhaps most Haredim do today, because most Haredim today don't see it as such a direct immediate threat. Zionism, certainly in America, isn't seen as luring people away from our community. In Israel, it's a bit trickier because this sort of choosing to leave the community kind of means joining the secular Zionist mainstream. So it's even that point is also is nuanced. But back then, the Rebbe Rashab is watching his community crumble in the face of these changes. And the Rebbe Rashab is reacting to this Nakuda, as he describes, the Tafresh test, that to them it's not about Torah mitzvahs, it's about nationalism. So even those that didn't throw Torah mitzvahs out the window, even those that remained religious, but are they seeing themselves as a hamshich, a continuation, or are they seeing themselves as something new, a new Jew, a modern Jew, with Torah mitzvahs? So I think in that context, the Rebbe Rashab saw these changes to chinuch, these changes to the Chumash. First of all, as the Rebbe Rashab said explicitly, when they change it, so they're going to create good Zionist kids who are not going to remain from. But also, even in the more abstract sense, coming along and saying we need to rethink the Chumash is coming from the same, as we say, the Sprach and Chabad, the same makim benefesh. It's coming from the same mindset that we need to rethink everything. Whatever worked for the previous Dur isn't good for us. So if they learn the entire Chumash, we have to be different, we have to be modern, we have to decide what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. So that whole mindset was extremely foreign, and the Rebbe Rashab was calling it out. And so, like I said, even though the Tafresh test, they claim, wow, what are you talking about? No one's doing it, no one's talking about it. But the reality was that, of course, it was inseparable, it's intertwined. This entire movement would ultimately be synonymous with throwing away the old chinuch and throwing away studying Chumash properly and replacing it with the highlights, selected passages where you're not relaying as the Kuntra said, they're not relaying that it's the Kedusha and the MS and the values, but it's just history, and you're implying that it's funny or silly or inappropriate. So that was really the Rebbe Rashab's point. So when certain changes happen, like I said, it's not clear that they always learn the whole Chumash from Aleph to Taf, from Bereshis to Le'ein Kol Yisrael. Back then, in theory, in principle, you were supposed to. That was if you asked anyone if you stayed by the Chumash Rebbe long enough, presumably you would have finished it. But Lav Dafka you did. But it seems like they did learn ala seder, either just Bereshis straight as far as you got, or every year over and over again, and there was no skipping in the way there is today. The fact that there is skipping today, and based on what I just said, and based on the Rebbe's reactions in different situations, where it seems like the Rebbe made a number of points. The Rebbe made a point that if you skip and the kids see that you're skipping, that could be counterproductive. That's one point the Rebbe made somewhere along the way. The Rebbe also seemed to say, though, that if you're already skipping other things, so then maybe if you want to skip something because you feel it's a little inappropriate or you can't teach it to the children, it's not the end of the world. It sort of seems to depend on the context. And I think that's because the Rebbe is not judging it in the same context that the Rebbe Rashab was judging it, that Kuntres was judging it. We're dealing with whether if it's a cheder in town, so it's very stark, or a cheder out of town that's already modern, and we're happy that the kids are coming at all and learning anything at all. So that's not the top concern necessarily. There may be other concerns that are more important, and it's not coming from a completely new educational shita that's where the conception is that we need to take a break from the past, but rather it happens a bit less consciously, a bit more casually. Like I said, at this point, the Frum Welt does seem to have internalized these values that there are things that are not appropriate. So it's seen as almost being a Haredi thing to do. The Haredi thing is also to skip. So personally, I would still lean towards team not skipping, and I would also lean towards maybe we should try to get the children to learn whole Chumash cheder. It's pretty funny to go into life and not have learned Chumash properly and not have learned Nach properly. And historically, clearly, even in Tafresh Samach Beis, they were at least paying fealty to the notion that you're supposed to learn the whole Tanakh, whether or not they were actually learning the whole Tanakh properly. They at least believe you should in theory. And we know the Maharal was already being moicha about the Sidrei Chinuch Bizmanoi and wanted it to be more Mesuder and Dafka Lefi Mekredes Chazal, als Mesudes Chazal, not als modern and being new and being different. So there is room for chidushim and shinuyim, I think, within the range of what our makers tell us. But our makers don't tell us to skip anything because it's inappropriate, and there's no good reason to. It's not the end of the world. I'm not gonna go and make a macha and say that it's the maskilim, and I think the same stands for the comments aleph which is also its own complex and somewhat confusing topic, where it's possible to say that the best is to stick to the Messiah, but it's also possible to say that, you know what, we're not looking to make official shinui, we're not looking to make a break with the past, but gradually, incrementally, mumchim pashat see kids are muching zich and they feel they're just trying to help the kid. It's not coming from a bad place. We see the huge chunks of the from world is not makbet at all in the comments, all things, they're not even aware of it. And to say that, so therefore they're secretly bringing haskalah into, it's hard to react to it with the same severity versus the context that the Rebbe Rashab and the Frierdiker Rebbe were reacting to this stuff. And the Frierdiker Rebbe came to America and he was flam fire about how the chedolim here that were run by people who weren't Yerei Shemayim were destroying children. So the comment of us stuff was under the subcategory. It was a subcategory under the larger umbrella of you're destroying kids. And one nakuda, one expression of that is that even the comment of they're changing the basics. They're severing, they're rupturing the connection with the Kedushas Ha'osius, with the Kedushas Chumash. Whereas when it happens now, it's not happening in the same context, and you need to be able to have that historical perspective to be able to have a more nuanced, calmer approach. So I think that's what that Chabad Rav was trying to express, that just because a Moscow said something, there's no Indian to be mahader to write an encyclopedia of exactly what the Charedim did and exactly what the maskilim did, and then make sure that we never make a single change that ever matches what a maskil ever wanted. That's not really the point. However, he expressed it in perhaps a less elegant way. I think this is a more elegant way of expressing that same point. So those are some of my thoughts. Interestingly, to point out that this kuntrus is focusing a lot, that's not about Lashon, and yet we find the Frierdiker Rebbe, who, like I just said, was very opposed and spoken in very similar extreme fashion about the Trefa Chadorim of his time, and yet recently I pointed out that Mamash in the Let's the Yard, and the Frierdiker Rebbe wrote that during the summer the children should focus on learning Tanakh, and they should focus on learning how to write Hebrew and how to express themselves in Hebrew properly. So deep down, ultimately, these are values, these are traditional values. It is a value to learn Tanakh, and there is a value to know Lashon Kodesh properly. And plenty of gedolim over the years had a nice, beautiful Lashon Kodesh. Some had less so, some had more so. We know, even within the Haredi world, there is a bit of like a self-conscious awareness that, we learn diktuk less now because the maskilim were into diktuk, or we learn pashat pshat a little less now because the maskilim were into pashat pshat. That is sort of an awareness that's still with us in certain, with regard to certain points. And even on those points, the Frierdiker Rebbe never actually fully gave up on it and still believe that they were important. They just have to be done within a fruma context. And I think with that we can conclude, although there were many other points that we could have elaborated on as well. One last note here, which is really doesn't fit in here, but I just have it on my notes in front of me, with regard to the letter of Reb Chaim Brisker. So if you take a look in Nagada Shal Pesach, Alei Zayas, Tavshin Ayin Hey, they cite it and they make a tzushtal from that letter to whatever they were, whichever Inyan they were being Isaac in there, but like they made a tzushtal to an Inyan and Halacha. Mabitzu Teru Musar, Chelik Aleph also has something on the letters of Reb Chaim Brisker, Bechlal, the lengthy Teichondik letters of Reb Chaim Brisker. So I have it here in front of me, I'm going to mention it. But that's another topic that we could have gone off onto, but we didn't have the time. But I hope that was all helpful and illuminating. Both gives us context for what we do, what we don't do, and also raises some questions about some of the shinuyim that we are making. But like I said, not out kanos, but to ask moderately whether these shinuyim are actually kedai and whether these concerns are real concerns. And in one of these articles, Shevet, he quotes from Mechanchem in the Dati Lumi world who were pro learning the Chumash, and they were asked, what are you going to do when you get to these psukim? So they answered, there's a way to go about it. The Rebbe has to speak about it in a matter-of-fact way and use edel language and not indicate that there's something funny or inappropriate or exciting. And Adrabah, you set the tone, and I can certainly relate to that. I think there probably have been a few occasions where learning with my children, maybe we came across psukim like this or something like this, and I don't I don't run and teach it ice and explain it in detail, but I don't shy away and run away from it either. And like I said, there's probably enough that the kids are not fully hopping anyway. So if the kid asks you, you can ask them back, and there are various ways to learn it, cover it, but shackle off extra unnecessary questions. Those are my thoughts, and with that, we conclude.